now 6:30, so we will make a start. Welcome everybody to the British Academy and to this Chartered Institute of Taxation and Institute for Fiscal Studies debate on taxing commercial property. I'm Glenn Fliller, I'm the President of the Chartered Institute of Tax. To my left is Ciot from the IFS, Peter Wyatt from Henry Business School, University of Reading, Jerry Shursk, Head of Business Rates for Gerald Eve, and Rachel Kelly from the British Property Federation. And I'll give you a little bit more. Their biographies are in here, and I'll introduce them before they speak a little bit more. This is approximately the 15th debate that the Chartered Institute of Tax and the IFS have hosted. I mean, that's economists are good at approximations. Those have all taken place in central London. Additionally, we've done a number of events at party conferences. And we joined together, both here in London and at the party conferences, to promote debate around taxation across a wide spectrum of taxation issues. I think this is the first time we've done something on property. I'm looking at one of my colleagues to try and, yes, I think I'm not getting any no's, so I'll take that as a yes. And this is a very topical debate, as tomorrow, as the Treasury Committee is currently undertaking an investigation into an inquiry into the impact of business rates, and two of the panellists, Rachel and Jerry, will be giving evidence to the Treasury Committee tomorrow. Matt Hancock, who's no longer, I was going to say no longer with us, but no longer with us in the sense that he's no longer in the Conservative Party leadership race. He was promoting the abolition of business rates for smaller businesses on the high street, so it is featured in that debate as well. So we will pose the question, should we retain, reform or retire business rates? If they are to be retired, what should they be replaced by? Should they be replaced by something such as a land value tax, or something more radical such as a tax on online sales to compensate for the loss of business rates and the fact that online sales are considered to be unduly lightened tax? If we are going to keep them in their current form, are there changes that should be made? The panel brings a range of perspectives to this debate: business, academic, and economic. And after speeches, we will open up for general discussion and questions and answers. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for that. This debate is being live streamed on the CIOT website. So in fact, the Treasury Committee can get all of their answers tonight if they're so inclined. And it will be available for viewing afterwards if you want to go back and experience the whole event all over again. If you are watching the live stream, do feel free to tweet to us your questions using the hashtag CIOTIFS debates, and we'll try and put some of those to the panel. And please do feel free to tweet from inside the room if you feel so inclined, using the same hashtag, which I think is probably behind me. So, with that, with no further ado, I shall introduce Ciot, who is a senior research economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who's written about many aspects of tax and benefit policy, including on land and property taxation. He was an author and editor of the Merleys report into the UK tax system, and wrote the IFS submission to the current Treasury Committee inquiry into business rates. Ciot.
So, a bit of background to the instant first bit now. Business rates is the UK's sixth biggest tax. It brings in about £31 billion a year. That's about 4% of total government revenue. And that's a figure that's actually been steadily declining not only over the last few years, but over the last 30 years. So if it's been, if anything, on the way down, why has it become controversial? Well, I think one reason is that it's widely blamed for some of the travails of many high street retailers. Now, business rates, which it emphasises very much not just a tax on retail, it's a tax on the value, the rental value of almost all non-domestic premises. But let me start by taking that argument head on, because I want to argue that, in essence, business rates are not killing the high street. The case for the prosecution is relatively straightforward. High street retailers are struggling to cope with online competition. A big part of that is the high cost of premises they face, and in turn, business rates are a big part of that cost of premises that online retailers have to pay. You know, some business rates on out-of-town warehouses and so on, but not nearly the same amount, say, as a percentage of their turnover. But actually, I think the contribution of business rates to that higher cost of premises is less obvious than it may seem, because while the businesses occupying the premises have to pay business rates themselves, we also need to bear in mind the less direct effects that business rates have on the market rents that they're charged in the first place, and indeed the property prices of the properties themselves. An economic theory would suggest that in the long run, business rates will mostly be reflected in rents and passed on to the landlords rather than ultimately being paid by the occupier. So without going too much into the details, it's essentially just a story of supply and demand. Because the supply of business property is relatively fixed, there's not a lot that landlords can do other than charge only what rent they can, they can, and still find a tenant for their premises. So business rates reduce what all potential tenants are willing to pay for a property. Landlords as a group basically just have to accept lower rents in order to find tenants for their premises. So essentially, if business rates weren't there, correspondingly higher rents would mean that premises were still almost as expensive for the businesses occupying them as they are now. It's just instead of having to pay rent and business rates, they would be paying that much more in rent. Now, there are caveats to this story. First of all, it's a long-run story. In the short run, that is simply not true. In the short run, if a firm sees its business rates bill go up, it has to pay it. It takes time for rents to adjust. And to some extent, it's an open question quite how quickly they do adjust, certainly more quickly, I think, than they used to, say, 30 years ago. Commercial rental contracts tend to be much shorter now, but it's still far from straight away. Second thing, though, even when we think about changes in business rates, bear in mind that, again, despite much of the media reporting, there hasn't been a general trend towards increases in business rates. Broadly speaking, they've kept pace with inflation. When there was a big revaluation in 2017, some firms certainly did see big changes, big increases in their liability, phased in gradually, but just as many saw reductions in their liability. And of course, those businesses that would have gone under if it hadn't been for a business rate reduction are less likely to make the news. Second caveat, that even in the long run, what I was the story I was describing just before is what Glenn aptly described as an economist simplification, or economist approximation. It's not a bad representation of reality, but even in the long run, the supply of property is not completely unresponsive to price signals, and so there is some effect on occupiers as well as renters. Nevertheless, the evidence we've got, the empirical evidence, while pretty limited, actually. There's not a huge amount of high quality evidence. The evidence that we have supports the theory pretty much bang on, that most, if not all, of the impact of business rates seems to be passed on to landlords in the rent they receive, at least in the long run, not necessarily in the short run. Now, the main reason why the long-run story I gave is not completely true, only mostly true, is that business rate is in effect a combination of two taxes. It taxes the total value of the property, but that's made up of the land and the buildings on the land. And we can think of those two parts separately. As far as the land itself is concerned, the story I would have told is pretty much completely true. The land is virtually in fixed supply, and there's not much that the owner or the occupier, for that matter, can do to change the value of the land themselves. It depends on the location, the amenities around it, things that broader society does, but not a lot that they can do about it. The buildings on the land, on the other hand, are built. They are constructed, and more or less of that can happen, and that depends on financial incentives. And those buildings are a produce input to production of exactly the kind that economic theory says that you shouldn't tax at all. Indeed, Nobel laureate William Vickery described a property tax as a combination of one of the worst taxes, the tax on real estate improvements, and one of the best taxes, the tax on land or site value. And we've argued in the past that we think, as far as business property is concerned, this description is exactly right. Taxing land is very efficient because it's in fixed supply. Taxing it doesn't disincentivize any valuable activity, but taxing buildings on it is not, the development and use of those buildings is not something we want to discourage. And this leads to an obvious proposal to replace business rates with a land value tax. So this would, for the reasons I've described, be economically efficient. Essentially, it would take out the buildings part of the tax, leave just the land tax, and therefore remove the disincentive that's there at the moment to develop and use business property. As a result, it would lead to slightly more and cheaper property than there is now. There would be some redistribution involved in this. It would be done on, say, a revenue-neutral basis. Clearly, the winners would be those owning with highly developed properties in relatively remote locations. Those would pay more for those with unused land or relative or less developed land nearer to prime locations. The key practical challenge with introducing a land value tax is valuing the land. And that's something I think we're going to hear more about from the other speakers in the panel, and we may come back to it in discussion. But basically, land and buildings are normally sold as a package, and figuring out how much the land is worth separately from the buildings is not a trivial job. Now, having said that, there are methods available, and various other countries do it. And I think a thorough official effort to look at the possibility of doing it would be very much worthwhile. It's worth bearing in mind that the efficiency gains from land value taxation don't actually depend on getting the valuations right. As long as there's nothing the owner or occupier can do about it, it's still perfectly efficient to levy arbitrarily different taxes on different plots of land. But clearly it wouldn't be fair to do that. And you start thinking about what would happen things like the appeals process. Accuracy starts to become more important, although of course if no one can figure out what the true value is, what the basis for an appeal would be is also not so clear. But for practical reasons or for other, perhaps political reasons, we might decide not to move to land value taxation. I'm actually reasonably open-minded as to whether the practical challenges are severe enough to put us off. If you were to do that, should we keep the existing property tax flawed as it is? Well, I think there would be a risk to throw, if you like, the land tax baby out with the buildings tax bathwater, but business rates could certainly be improved. Now, some of the things that the government has been doing, is doing at the moment, are actually improving business rates, moving the revaluation of properties from every 5 years, or 7 years last time, to every 3 years, is an improvement. It's better to base taxes on what properties are worth as near as we can now, and let it respond as property values change. Moving from uprating every year in line with RPI inflation to CPI inflation is a clear improvement. RPI is just a bad measure, shouldn't be used for anything anymore. But there will be scope for improving it further. I've put a question mark in brackets here because I think some of the things I'm going to mention, I'm not going to discuss them all in depth now. I think are things that would be definite improvements. Some, I think, are worth consideration, but have downsides as well as upsides. So one thing you could do is take these two existing changes further. So you could move to even more frequent revaluations. Many people are in favour of annual revaluations. Again, in an ideal world, that would be great. There is clearly, as it stands, an administrative cost to doing revaluations annually rather than every 3 or 5 years, and I'm not really in much of a position to judge whether that administrative cost, how big that is and whether it's worth the benefits, or indeed whether the way we do revaluations could be reformed to make it more efficient, so that it wasn't quite as costly. If we are doing revaluations, one thing that I would definitely like to see is move towards, in years in between revaluations, update valuations in line with, just say, a local property price index to give some sense of properties in this neighbourhood have gone up, tending to get more or less expensive relative to those in other neighbourhoods, just so that when full revaluation comes, it isn't the changes needed aren't as sharp. Similarly, rather than just moving from RPI to CPI inflation, you could move away from uprating it in line with inflation altogether, and move towards actually just keeping business rates a fixed percentage of rents and therefore go up and down, responding as rents go up and down. More fundamentally, there are a whole bunch of reliefs in business rates, some of which I think should definitely be got rid of. I don't think there's any justification for providing relief for vacant land, and it's what creates the problems that we see with relief for empty properties as well. Agricultural property, it's hard to see a principled reason for exempting. I think more debatable, but again worth considering, is whether the regime we have with lower rates for low-value properties is justified. I think there can be a case made for that, but I think the argument's certainly making. There are, if you like, more techie issues, but not necessarily unimportant ones, like the way that plant machinery is treated in property valuations. One thing that you could consider is actually changing the formal liability for the tax from the occupier to the owner. Now, in the long run, I think the incidence is largely on the owner anyway, it's largely the owner that feels it, so I'm not sure this would make a huge difference, but it to some extent would make it more transparent, and mean that those kinds of rent adjustments that I was talking about simply weren't needed. On the other hand, it would be a big change. There would be a big rent adjustment if this did happen. And there are various practical questions about defining and identifying the owner, for example, in cases of long leases. So I think some of these would definitely be improvements, some are worth considering. But I would also say that there is a case for actually stopping doing as much as we've done recently. Over the last 10 years, business rates has gone from being previously one of the most stable, predictable taxes we had in the tax system to being one of the least. And that is not a welcome development. So to give just one example of that, reliefs for small retailers and low-value properties were introduced in 2014, got rid of again in 2016, reintroduced again in 2019, and are due to go away again in 2021. Now, why small retailers ought to get a relief in those particular 4 years, but not the years before, in between, or after, is something of a mystery to me. Whether or not you think there is a good case for that, it's not clear that either the social benefits of having small retailers, or, for example, the threat from online, is particularly a 2-year issue. So let's make the argument for either why it ought to be there or why it ought not to be there, and set a tax system that's credible for the long term. So just to wrap up very briefly, I don't think business rates are primarily responsible for killing the high street overall, notwithstanding the pain that business rate rises for individual firms can undoubtedly cause. But business rates do harm, particularly by deterring the development and use of business property. The UK economy is just biased against property-intensive activity. Replacing it with a land value tax would avoid that if the obstacles to accurate valuation aren't considered prohibitive. But business rates could also be improved in less radical ways. I'll stop there and hand over.
I think that was a score draw between land value tax and just improving rates. So I'll now hand over to Professor Peter Wyatt, Professor of Real Estate Appraisal at the Henley Business School, which is part of the University of Reading. Peter is a chartered valuation surveyor, the lead author of United Nations Guidelines on the Valuation of Tenure Rights, and co-author of Investigation of Potential Land Value Tax Policy Options for Scotland.
Thanks, good. Thank you. Good evening and welcome. Has anyone else got damp feet? Quite uncomfortable. So thank you for coming along. The title I've got on my presentation is Valuation Challenges of Taxing Commercial Property, but I am going to focus on the land tax side because that's what I know most about. You're a room full of tax experts, and I'm a valuer, so I'm going to stick to what I know because that's probably the safest thing for me to do. So just with that in mind, and I guess the second thing I probably should say before I start is land tax generates quite a lot of heated debate amongst certain factions and groups, and I'm not one of those. So I can't make up my mind whether a land tax is a good or a bad idea. So all I'm going to do really is try and highlight some of the issues that surround land taxation as far as I can see them, as far as the literature and the academia sees it. So just to start with a slide of taxes, really focusing on the recurrent taxes, but this slide is really just saying that you can't ignore the event-based taxes that sit alongside those recurrent taxes. You know, we're taxing every year, but we also tax on the basis of other things that go on, and particularly with property, there's quite a few of those. And I'll come back to some of those later, particularly land value capture, and explain a bit about that. So we're focused really on the sort of business taxes, but that does sit alongside residential taxes, and they both bring in about the same amount of money as far as I can tell. You said those are two. It must be similar from council tax.
Council slightly more, marginal.
Despite the massive difference in the number of tax-paying entities that we're talking about. So businesses don't vote, but council tax payers do. So that's probably one of those. So that's really the background. When we talk about taxing land, we're talking about trying to perhaps vary that tax based on the utility that land or property offers. And we measure utility mainly in terms of the economics, the economic utility, and there are various ways of doing that. And valuation is only one of them. We could just do it on area, site area or floor area. We could do it on number of stories of the buildings. We could do it on windows, which I think we did a few years ago. And I think when we started with business rates, we started in Leeds, I think it was, where we taxed on where you had a gable end or the side elevation of a building fronting the high street. So There's all sorts of ways of doing it. Valuation seems to be a pretty popular way of doing it. But then there are iterations of value. There is capital values, there's rental values, which we obviously favour for business rates. So different ways of doing it, and there are different reasons why we choose those different routes to measuring utility. The focus really tonight is whether taxing land, i.e. unimproved land, is better than taxing property or improved land. Stuart's made the case, the economic case, and it's an undeniable economic case. It's made by literature in many cases, so I'm not going to dwell on that. I'll just highlight one or two other bits and pieces that relate to taxing land, and they relate to the area of land and property management, the built environment, where I come from, which is that you incentivise the development of unimproved land if you get the tax right. You can possibly not bother with taxing development value increases when you give planning consent to change the use of land, for example, or increase the density, because you're going to capture it anyway through your fantastic land value tax. There are problems with valuation. Stuart mentioned those. I'll come to those in a bit. There's no vacancy issue, because you're just going to tax it whether it's being used or not. That's the whole point. You're trying to perhaps incentivise its use. And it goes to the owners. But the owners might need to redistribute that. They might need to collect it in some way. If you're in a big block of flats, very high land tax bill, you might be trying to recover that by your service charge or increased rent or whatever it might be, if you can. On the property side, we're taxing improvements, and so that disincentivises making those improvements. If you tax them, obviously there's an inefficiency there. So why do we do it? Well, it's robust. We've got lots of comparable evidence. One of the reasons why we do rental valuations for business rates, and Jerry might say more about this, is because there's no evidence of those kinds of transactions in the commercial market. They're not clouded by investment decisions where you need to think about yields and how those affect in terms of buying property, trading property for investment purposes rather than for occupational purposes. It's probably better understood. Less appeals. I put a question on there. There are quite a few appeals in business rates, so that's not a given. You overcome the planning issue, and I'll come back to that. It's quite an important valuation concern that many have. And it gets around that by valuing as it is. So you're valuing the property as it is, its existing use, as opposed to what it could be used for if it was to be used for that, a different use. And it's a combination of a wealth tax and a services tax. You know, businesses do need their bins emptied, and they do need security. So you're kind of taxing on the services as well as the increases in land value, you might see. And it's an occupier's liability, generally speaking. Now, I did have a tax in between that last one and this one, which is about business rates, but I've hidden it because Jerry's here, and Jerry will talk about business rates probably in far better more detail than I can. So I'm just going to use my time to talk more about the land tax and what's happening around the world, and Stuart asked me to mention this, because we did a bit of work for the Scottish Land Commission on what was going on in other countries with land taxes. So generally speaking, in terms of land and property taxes, most countries have transfer taxes, you know, the stamp duty type of taxes. Lots of countries have inheritance taxes and capital gains taxes. Not many countries have just a land tax on its own. Lots of countries have land tax that sit alongside a property tax. And I'm just going to highlight 3 of those because they're interesting and they kind of relate a bit to what we're talking about this evening. But there are other countries, but they tend not to sit on their own. They certainly don't sit in a kind of Henry George pure land tax to replace all other taxes from that perspective. But they really don't sit alongside, rather they do sit alongside other land and property taxes as well. So they are part of a mix of taxes. So let's just focus on these for a moment. And Australia is the first one. Now they have state, countrywide land taxes, land value taxes, and local land value taxes. But it's the local ones that most people end up having to pay, because there's lots of exemptions and reliefs from the state land taxes. There are other land and property taxes too, so things like the transfer taxes that I talked about. They base those land value taxes on highest and best use, and I'll come back to that. That's quite an important distinction from what we have as business rates, which is existing use. They do have problems when trying to work out what is improved and what is unimproved. So how much unimproved land is there left in England or the UK? Not a lot. It's undergone some kind of improvement, whether it's levelling, irrigation, cultivation, whatever it might be. Where do you draw the line in terms of unimproved? And that's an issue that Australia is trying to grapple with, and they've come up with these rather strange definitions of unimproved value for the rural and site value for the urban where it has been serviced in some way. It's constantly changed. It's not hugely popular in Australia, so that's just a note that. In New Zealand, probably the longest standing land tax country, although the land tax that was introduced back in the 19th century, the statewide land tax, went in the early 90s. And what's left is local taxes, like from the municipalities. Differentially, they don't have transfer taxes, inheritance taxes, and they have very limited capital gains tax. So they are more of a kind of this is the tax that you pay. It's either a land tax or, increasingly now, those local taxes are property-based taxes. And there are various reasons for that. Mainly it's to do with the difficulty in valuing land in places like Auckland and Wellington, places that are growing rapidly. And secondly, the increases in value are quite politically controversial. So they've kind of let back on the land taxes and favoured the property taxes. And they're allowed to choose which one they give. So in the past, lots of land taxes, now much less and more property taxes in New Zealand, the local. And then Denmark, an obvious tax-based country, has lots of taxes, and one of them was land value tax, or is land value tax, introduced 1902. They do have other property taxes too. Even Denmark, which regarded in property circles as kind of the leading light in terms of land tax, it's kind of waning slightly, so they are shifting away towards taxes on property use rather than ownership, questioning the ability to revalue on a regular basis the land values, even though they have a fantastic cadaster, fiscal and legal cadaster to help them do those regular revaluations. They base their tax on highest and best use. I'll come back to that. They also have a rezoning tax, so as well as having the land tax, they do have this uplift tax. When you get consent to change use, they do have that as well. Agricultural land and forestry is subject to land tax, unlike human works. So that's really a run through of 3 countries. Why isn't it more widespread? Well, I'll try and delve into the issues, and I'll briefly. Politics, obviously, is a major issue. And it's difficult to dismantle centuries of land ownership rights. And I mean that because I say land ownership rights because taxing land is taking away a right to not be taxed. It is one of those very political issues, particularly in a property-owning democracy like we have. It has a relationship with those other taxes. We get a lot of money from those other taxes, whether they're transfer taxes, increasingly land value capture, the likes of CIL or Community Infrastructure Levy, planning obligations, bring in a lot of money for the government. So how will a land tax affect those? Then there are the exemptions and the reliefs and the differential rates that business rates is grappling with, as Stuart pointed out, in terms of the sort of swaying between offering relief and taking it away again. But if you bring in a land tax, you can't tax everything at the same rate, because if you're taxing agricultural land, it would be a much lower rate than it would be if it was high street, retail, even distribution, warehouse, Amazon type buildings. So there's lots to think about on what you're taxing and what level you're taxing. And then there are those other issues that are well known about the ability to pay, the sort of cash poor, asset rich property owners, and the windfall loss of the midterm catchment. You know about this sort of stuff. Let me focus on the other technical issues. Focusing on the non-valuation issues first, you do need a register of ownership, a cadastre. We don't have one. We have general boundaries rules, so we don't really know. We don't have a contiguous mosaic of land ownership. We have a temporally mixed land register. We have an index map that gives you a rough idea, but it's not. It's missing. It's overlapping. So that's not brilliant. So we need to sort that out. You need a land use cadastre. You need to know what you're going to assign or allocate the land use for on each of those parcels of land. That's a big job. Other countries try and resolve that by having a zoning system of planning. They forward plan what uses are going to go on the bits of land. But we don't do that in this country. We have a discretionary basis for our planning. So you approach the planning authority and ask for permission to change the use. Now, subject to obviously a local plan, etc. But that's discretionary. It's reactive rather than proactive. So that makes valuation very difficult because you've got to determine what the highest and best use is, the optimum use for those land parcels is. And if planners are doing that, will they get it right? Your tax experts, economists as well, will planners be able to optimally allocate land to its highest and best use, its optimally most efficient use? Regarding infrastructure, land use limits, that sort of thing. And what is unimproved land? I've talked a bit about that in the Australian example. Just delving in to the last slide, the one in terms of the valuation practicalities. Do we value existing use or highest and best use? If you want to try and influence the way land is being used, you need to go down the highest and best use route rather than existing use. But what planning is assumed? If you do manage to allocate each land parcel to its highest and best use, what do you assume for its neighbouring uses? You know, if you're a planner and you say, I'm going to allocate this land to be a new town, and you happen to be on a piece of land where it would be residential, that might be a big increase in value if that new town gets developed and increases value. But should you evaluate it that way, or should you assume that it's not going to be part of a bigger development? It's a compulsory purchase problem of no scheme world. It's that issue that arises when you have to value to highest and best use. Just flicking through these, unimproved, it's difficult to define where you draw the line between improved and unimproved. We'll need an evidence base, we'll need land transactions to work with. That's why we don't use it for rates, why business rates uses rents. We'll need a good method of doing those valuations. I can think of four. There's the blue book method where you just basically strip out the cost of the buildings and you're left with the value of the land from your property value. It's very much an accountancy-based rule, and it doesn't really reflect the market value of land. You can do it as a percentage of the property value. Contractors test and rating does that. You could extrapolate evidence that you do have, the little that you do have. You can build a regression model, and you could do that. It might be difficult to understand if you're a taxpayer. Or you could do the classic residual method, the backing out method that valuers do for development. So there are different ways of doing it, but we'll need to agree that. And then there's the optional hope value, which hopefully your land tax will get rid of because you're regularly valuing it. But some of it's down to property, the actual building on site. So still, you can offset some of your existing building space when you're building new residential space for tax purposes. So there is hope value in what's there already. So that So to conclude, it's unpopular, but people do recognise the equity of taxing property, so maybe we shouldn't be ignoring it. Why is it so problematic? Why are so many countries not adopting land tax? Well, it is difficult to, we don't all have these clean sheets of paper we can start with. So there's lots of inertia in the system that you need to address. We also have lots of existing taxes, and they're embedded, so those would need to be addressed. So to conclude, land value tax is supported by economists, I would argue difficult, challenging to implement. Land value capture has been our fallback situation, and that's gaining ground. It's the only development land tax that's survived a change of government. Free, actually, if you could encourage. So that's where we are. And the bulk of land value, research I'm doing at the moment is showing that if you do switch to a land value tax, the bulk of the value is tied up in residential land, not business. Well, that goes to the whole percentage. Now, at the moment, business, in terms of recurrent taxes, businesses make about 52% of the recurrent property tax base. According to my calculations for a little case study, that would decline significantly and increase for residential if we switch to a land tax. So politically, that would be a big one. I'll leave it at that.
Peter, I'm not quite sure you sold the land value tax there. I knew eventually in these debates we'd get around to the window tax, so thank you very much for that. So we'll now move on to Rachel. Rachel Kelly, and I should get my notes back. Problem with electronics. Rachel is the Senior Policy Officer at the British Property Federation, a trade body representing the commercial real estate industry. She previously worked as a tax manager at PwC, so has a tax industry background. And at the BPF, she formulates industry responses on matters that impact the flows of capital into UK real estate, including tax regulatory and reporting issues. And the British Property Federation aims to promote a proportionate and stable tax and regulatory environment for investors in UK property. We do the same, trying to promote a simplified tax system. I hope you have more success than we do. Rachel.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much. It's good to be here. It's certainly an area that we're very interested in. I'm going to run through three broad areas. I'm going to look at, well, what do we think good looks like? What do we think needs to change? And then touch on a few of the potential alternatives. So starting with what does good look like? According to the Treasury Select Committee's recent inquiry, their pillars of good tax-making policy are tax should be fair, tax should support growth and encourage competition, it should provide certainty, and it should be coherent. And I think most people would agree with that. I certainly would. And I also think that most people that have any interaction with business rates would agree that business rates falls well short of meeting some of those criteria. And I'll go through what I think the kind of key areas are where I think that it falls short and where it could improve. But also just to touch on the kind of basket of taxes. Broadly, you've got recurrent taxes and transactional taxes on property, of which business rates is a recurrent tax. On the whole, we would agree with, and a lot of economists would agree that actually recurrent taxes tend to be less damaging, particularly in terms of transactional activity than transactional taxes like SDLT. And actually, well, and interestingly, a few years ago we surveyed our members to ask what they thought the most damaging taxes were on their business. SDLT came up tops, no surprises there. Business rates was actually second, and VAT was third. I think partly because VAT is similar to a transactional tax in a real estate context in some ways. But SDLT isn't the highest, by quantum, isn't the most amount of tax that's paid by our sector. So I think it just shows that businesses, that it's not necessarily the quantum that's important, it is the design of the tax. People do want fairness, they do want certainty, all of those good things. But anyway, I guess my point is that we're happy with a recurrent tax in terms of the whole basket of taxes that we have to pay. I think a recurrent tax on property is not necessarily a bad thing. So what don't we like? What does need to change? These are I guess from a high level what we want is an agile and responsive tax system, that we want a business rate system that reflects the true value of the space that businesses are occupying in real time. And so our primary asks, which we think will help the tax system get there, is we think that the total tax burden on business rates should be reduced. We think that the total tax yield should fluctuate in line with the economy. We think the revaluation should take place more frequently, ideally annually. I'll probably disagree with the first two things, that we actually think that there should be relief, or entry rates relief should be reinstated to a certain extent. I'm going to take each of those in turn just to explain why there are kind of key priority areas. So number one, we think the total business rates burden should be reduced. Business rates was introduced in the 90s and it's gone up by inflation every year ever since. And uniquely, I think, for any tax, the total burden is set by government in advance, and then it's allocated between the businesses that occupy property. So why is that a problem? Partly because using inflation as a measure doesn't necessarily reflect the changes that are happening in the economy, and certainly doesn't reflect necessarily the changes happening in the property market. And the economy is changing. Commercial property isn't necessarily as good a proxy for where value is generated in the economy as it once was. It's possible to run a business from your kitchen table. So there might be a need to consider whether the burden should be so high on commercial property. And so these successive increases in the business rates burden has led in our view to a burden which is unsustainably high and out of kilter with the true value of the premises the businesses are occupying. And as these graphs show, it's completely out of kilter with with our peers. It's well above the OECD average, and we're the top, one of the top of in terms of kind of G7 peers. So ask number two is, we think the total tax should fluctuate in line with the economy, and I guess I touched on it on the last slide. We think that when the economy is doing well, business can bear a higher burden, and when the economy is doing badly, businesses need a bit of support, and the business rates burden could reflect that by going down. Alternatively, you could use a measure like rental growth. And what this graph shows is, this is a 10-year average from 2006 to 2016, showing the difference between business rates increases, the red one in the middle, and rental values, which is the blue one. So you can see that for the office sector, business rates has consistently increased higher than office rents for that 10-year period. But for the retail sector, that's been, on average, going down in that 10-year period, and yet business rates has still gone up by 3% a year. So I guess it just shows kind of how disconnected or how inappropriate that measure's been for most property, certainly retail. I think that's... So then that kind of brings us to our third ask. So we want a business rate system that reflects the true value of the premises that people are occupying. We haven't had that, certainly not in the last 10 years, perhaps longer. I think that, certainly it's not the only challenge that's faced the high street, but it has exacerbated the challenges that businesses on the high street are facing. I mean, even today there are businesses whose business rates bill still does depend to a certain extent, because of transactional relief, on their values in 2010, which just makes absolutely no sense given the kind of structural shift that that part of the economy has had. So we think that more frequent revaluations will enable the business rate system to be more responsive, to reflect the true value of commercial property, to ease the burden where businesses are no longer able to pay, but also to capture the value more quickly where where there's been kind of emerging and growing economies using different kinds of space in our economy, so kind of better for everybody. Yeah, better and a more sustainable tax we're going to lead to. And it's important to reiterate that we don't think this is just a retail issue. You know, I've got a few examples on here. Airbnb is disrupting the hotel industry. The way we use office space is changing. Apparently, it's projected in the next 5 years, the amount of serviced office space is going to double. And who knows what driverless cars and drones are going to do in terms of changing our economy, changing our consumer preferences, changing the way we use property. It just goes to show that we shouldn't be overly focusing on retail, and we should make sure that if we're going to be making changes to the business rates system, that we're doing it for all property classes. And then our final ask, perhaps the more contentious one on the panel. We think that empty rates really should be reinstated. We think that it's a tax on failure to force a landlord to pay a tax at the very point that they have no rental income to pay it with. And I appreciate that it should kind of, in theory, it should incentivise investors to let out their property, but I'd argue that they're already incentivised to let out their property. They've made an investment because they want to make a return on that investment, and so they're already incentivised to find a tenant to occupy that space. And I think that, I suppose my last 2 points are kind of interrelated. I think that in some ways it hinders productivity and sustainability. When you think about wider government objectives around sustainability targets and the technological advances mean that we've got a huge kind of huge amount of existing commercial stock that needs to be retrofitted with advanced technologies, fast broadband, whatever it might be. And having this huge tax burden means that landlords are in less of a position to be able to make those changes. And actually, and thinking about adaptability, when we think about the changes on our high street, I think a lot of people would agree that the future of our high streets are going to be less retail focused, they're going to have a slightly greater mix of space, different occupiers, different tenants, landlords need space and time to be able to make those changes and invest in those properties without being hit by a huge business rates burden. So I've kind of touched on what I think the areas of the existing business rate system need to change to improve it. I thought I would just touch briefly on a few of the alternatives and kind of high-level views on those, just to show you why we've erred on reforming the existing system as opposed to going with some of these alternatives. I won't talk about all of them, not least because I don't know enough about all of them to talk about them, but the two main ones in the debate, as far as I'm aware, are the online sales tax and the land value tax. In terms of the online sales tax, I'm not sure that's the right, well, I guess going back to my previous point, this is not just a retail issue. The business rate system needs to work for all asset classes and needs to be prepared to adapt and be agile for however we choose to use commercial real estate in the future. So I think if we choose a solution that just targets retail, I think that would be a mistake. But on top of that, I'm not convinced that an online sales tax is the right solution for retail to address any kind of perceived imbalances. I think a lot of people would say that the future of retail is going to be omnichannel. People are going to be using property, but also going to be using online. And so it doesn't necessarily feel right to just effectively tax a different part of the same sector. And so I guess on top of, so I guess in terms of the clicks versus bricks debate, my instinct would be to kind of look towards the work that the OECD done on taxation of the digital economy and taxation of global businesses, and kind of look to support their work as opposed to trying to come up with anything too radical. And then the other three, not only do I not know enough about them, they just instinctively feel quite complex. And I think in theory a kind of a property tax should be, one of the merits of a property tax is that it should be quite simple. So moving on to a land value tax, I think conceptually there are certainly a lot of things that are quite appealing about it. Like making sure that everyone's incentivised to use space in the most optimal way, and I especially like one of the potential benefits around incentivising improvements to property, which arguably the existing business rate system doesn't do. But I've popped down a few reservations here. I guess the first one would be, I'm not really sure what optimal use of space means, but I'm not sure if it's what we want. If we're talking about financially optimal use of space, if I think about, say, what we think our high streets might need to adapt, we might not necessarily just need the kinds of use classes that will, bring in the biggest profits. We might want a GP surgery, we might want a library, we might want a park. Those are the kinds of things that create good places, and I think that perhaps a land value tax could detract from people being able to do that. As touched on, there will be big winners and losers. I guess not least the likes of small businesses and charities and other people that currently get reliefs. It's hard to know how you would target relief so well with a land value tax if the tax is charged on the owner of the land rather than the occupier. There are the planning considerations that have been mentioned. Would we need to move to some kind of zonal planning system? Is it fair to charge somebody on a potential optimal use when you don't even know if it's possible to even get that use class through planning? I don't know. The land use register has been mentioned, which I think is something that we need to consider how we would create a comprehensive land use register in the UK. I completely agree that valuations will certainly become a lot more contentious, I think. There were a few of our kind of considerations for a land value tax, and hopefully help explain why we think improving the existing system is probably the best way to go at the moment. Thank you very much.
That was definitely improve the current system, but lower taxation. If you don't ask, you don't get, so that's perfectly okay, Rachel, thank you. So our final speaker this evening is Jerry Schroeder, the Head of Business Rates for Property Consultants, Gerald Eve. Jerry is responsible for coordinating and organising the partnership's extensive rating business, leading a team of over 60 rating surveyors. He is a past president of the Rating Surveyors Association and a member and former chair of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors Rating and Local Taxation Policy Panel. Jerry.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Apology, but rating is complex, so that's why my slides are not appearing. They'll be done in PDF rather than in PowerPoint. But in any event, I mean, the truth is that my colleagues here, and thank you to each of you, have done such an excellent job, and have probably between you covered off all the topics that I wanted to say. I was thinking of doing the Boris Johnson and just leaving the podium empty. Everything has been done. But no, I'll skip over some of the topics and spend a little time on some of the other ones. The title of this talk was, is it time to tweak business rates or replace them with a land value tax? The answer, I think, is well, no, neither. We shouldn't be doing either of those, and I will be explaining probably more about why the tweaking of non-domestic rates, business rates, doesn't work. It's got to be a lot more radical than that. But I don't think we are ready to be, as you've heard, reasons why, as radical as ditching it for land value taxation. Certainly not for some years, or maybe decades going forward. What I just want to sort of, the way I'm going to approach this is just to give to you the 9 recommendations that Geraldine made to the Treasury Select Committee for changes to the system, or the way in which the system should work. I'll cover those off in a little bit of detail, and yeah, I guess we'll be quizzed about some of those tomorrow in front of the committee. The first is, Rachel has explained the reasons really, a property tax should remain within the basket of the corporate taxes available to government to tax business and business operations. There are lots of problems with the operation at the moment, but yes, it's right. Modern economies all include some form of property taxation. That doesn't make it right, but it makes you ask the question why. We've heard a number of reasons from Rachel, but I mean, the property is there, it's visible, it's fixed, you can't shift it, you can't move it like profits. It's very difficult, therefore, to avoid and to evade, because you can identify who the occupier and therefore the ratepayer is. It's quite easy, really, to value most properties. The valuation office doesn't make you think that's the case, but it ought to be relatively simple to value property. And as far as the government, and particularly local government, it's very easy to collect. There's a 98% plus, touching on 99% collection rate of this tax. So it's not going away. It is not going to be removed. There are problems and it should be addressed. And I say, I'll come to it, we should be reducing the burden, as Rachel has said. But yeah, we should keep a property-based tax. And for the reason that Peter has explained, it should continue to be based upon annual rental values. That is where the evidence is, and actually business understands rent. They understand the rental value of their property. They may not understand rentable values, which actually are based on rental values, but there's been such a big disconnect that they don't really understand the relationship between rents and the rates that they pay. A very big one, this is the third recommendation, which hasn't really been covered off, but I think it's fundamental if we are ever to have a sustainable and fair business rate system, is that there needs to be transparency, proper transparency within the system, and the assessing body, that's the valuation office agency, should be justifying its valuations to the ratepayer. Rates are a comparative tax. Property rental values, they have regard, they may have regard to the rent payable on the actual property, if there is a rent. But you've also got to look at what are the basket of evidence. What is the rental evidence for all other properties? And that information is not in the public domain, and it's not easily accessible to the taxpayer, to the ratepayer. If you're a freeholder of a factory in Macclesfield, you have nothing to contribute to the assessment of rental value of your property. You are entirely therefore dependent upon what rents were paid for other similar properties in the locality at the relevant valuation date. There's one body that has that information, it's the Valuation Office Agency, because they collect all of the evidence, they have statutory powers to demand it from businesses. But the actual taxpayer, he has no opportunity to find out that information, other than through maybe instructing an agent who has to do a lot of work themselves to find out what evidence there was in the locality. The government, through the changes made to the appeal system in 2017 with the revaluation, brought in a whole new preposterous system, check, charge, appeal. I shall say more about that hopefully tomorrow morning. I will need to take diazepam, because otherwise I shall be venting my fury in a way that I might regret. But what the new system has done is to put the entire burden of proof on the ratepayer. The ratepayer has to prove that the valuation is incorrect. The valuation officer got it wrong. And in order just to open the door to a discussion with the valuation office about the assessment, he has to put together the entirety of his or her case up front, has to collect all potentially relevant evidence, put all the arguments, the analysis of that rent. The entire burden of proof is on the ratepayer. That's not the way to operate a fair taxation system. Business rates is different from every other tax, and you will know much more about the other taxes, because in the main, that's completely true, a business has within its grasp, within its control, its own information which will determine, well, VAT has to pay, or corporation tax has to pay. It may need professional advice to assist with the preparation and submission of the information, but actually, essentially, they have the information. They can self-assess. Not so with business rates. It is all dependent upon the availability of evidence which is just not there. So, I say all that has to change, and the onus should shift to the assessing body justifying itself to the taxpayer. I agree entirely that the business rate is too high, and it's got to be cut quite significantly. We've seen in the international context some different, slightly different versions of the slides that Rachel produced, but recurrent property taxes, those business rates and council tax, as a proportion of total taxation, 2017, you'll see we're way up the top there of the EU countries, and similarly as a proportion of GDP, we are at the top of OECD countries. So, it is a very significant tax, and some of the reasons why other taxes are less disputed in other countries is because the rate of charge is considerably lower. Where we've got such a high tax rate, businesses are bound to want to look very, very closely at the amounts that they are paying. Just coming back to the international dimension, we're very grateful to Opal Vauxhall, who have given me this sort of information, hopefully for use tomorrow. Vauxhall have looked at the property taxes, the local property taxes they pay across all of their estate in Europe. 8% of the floor space they occupy in Europe is in the UK. But 67% of what they pay in local property taxes is in the UK too. That is the extent of the disparity between what we pay here in local property taxes and what is paid elsewhere in Europe. And of course that is going to sort of to weigh in those who are considering investment in the UK, and operation in the UK, if their property taxes are lower elsewhere. I disagree with the suggestion that actually business rates haven't really grown in real terms, maybe they've been reducing. We started off in 1990 when the current system came into being with a tax rate, a uniform business rate was 34.8p in the pound. It has now grown this year to 50.4p. So it's a tax rate of over 50% of the assessed value. By far, of course, the highest tax rate, or any tax rate that we have in this country. Business rates in 1990 raised £10.4 billion in total at the gross level. We're now over £30 billion. That is almost double the rate of inflation, never mind which rate you choose, certainly above CPI, but even RPI was about 118%, and the amount of business rates taken has grown to almost triple almost what it was in 1990. So I say that in order for business rates to again to be fair and sustainable, the cost, the burden should reduce by about a third. We should be looking at a tax of about a third of rental values, and I suggest that business actually would accept that that is a fair, a reasonable contribution to pay towards local government and the provision of local services. But that is all dependent, of course, on that third of rental value being kept up to date. We've heard that we only revalue every 5 years, sometimes every 7 years, this is revaluation every 4 years, and we're going to every 3 years. But even that is not adequate. There are two major changes, I think, for this whole 1/3 of rental values to be fair. The first is at the moment we have a 2-year gap between the valuation date and the date on which the assessments come into force. That's to allow time for the valuation office to collect the information, analyse it and apply it to the valuation of all properties. Well, that may have been necessary in 1990 when computers hardly existed and all the rest of it. It really should not be necessary nowadays. It's crazy that the assessments on which you pay rates are already 2 years out of date when they come into force. And this was exacerbated at the 2010 revaluation, when the valuation date was 1st of April 2008, at about the peak of the property market. And by the time you got to April 2010, well, everything had plummeted. So they were already out of date on the first day. Never mind by the time we got 7 years down the line to the next revaluation. So we've got to sort of shorten that period. I mean, this is akin to sort of saying, to a business, well, I know you're not making any money at the moment, but you made profits a few years ago, so we're going to charge you on those. That's what we're doing in business rates. We're always looking backwards and we've got to be more up to date. And that's why I wholeheartedly support the call for annual revaluations. That's the best way. Have a 1-year antecedent valuation date, 1 year from the date of valuation to the date of the assessment coming in force, and we revalue every year to make sure that we keep up to date with changes in the economy, changing the market. We reflect those in the new valuations, and therefore in the rates payable. And effectively, think about it, that will take appeals out of the system, because if, firstly, the valuation office justifies itself to the ratepayer and says, the reason I'm charging you at £100 a square metre is because I have full rents in the locality, in your street or neighbourhood, at about £100 a square metre, and say, yeah, I got that. And actually, even if you think it's a bit high, is it worth appealing for a maximum saving of 1 year? And I'm going to take all those fees anyway, so there's no point. Why bother appealing? So you can strip out appeal. The valuation office can concentrate, therefore, on just keeping valuations up to date, keeping in touch with the market, keeping assessments fair and reasonable. And if you want to be fully responsive, or properly responsive to taxes, at the points already been made by Stuart, made by Rachel, we should make sure that actually revaluations are not a revenue neutral exercise. That's the way they work at the moment. All of these winners and losers. You know, you would have your rateable value going down, but your rent payable still goes up because of the way the system works. It's crazy, it's far too complex. We should have a fixed uniform business rate, I say about a third, 33% UBR, and the amount that the Exchequer raises every revaluation goes up or down in line with changes in annual property values in aggregate terms. That's the way taxes work elsewhere. You know, the Exchequer receives more or less depending on the way the economy behaves. Business rates is the only one that sort of continue goes up and up and up and up in line with inflation. Last two, very briefly. Firstly, the government's got to review all the rates, reliefs and exemptions to make sure that what we have is fit for purpose. There are a plethora of reliefs within the system, at least 15 at the last count, and the sort of government keeps them around in sticky plasters. They're far too complex, business don't understand, they don't understand what they're entitled to. Some councils give them a matter of course, others you've got to claim them. Most of them subject to European state aid rules, which limit the amount of relief you can get anyway, and therefore the government claims those are properties going to benefit, perhaps a lot of the larger businesses don't benefit from them in any case. Yes, we should be reviewing, Stuart mentioned quite rightly, is it right for agriculture to have an exemption? I can't see that we're ever going to get rid of that one. But, you know, I'm probably brave enough to raise it. Charity relief, that's another politically sensitive one, but is it right that charities should still get 80% relief, you know, for all their properties that they're occupying? That includes private schools, private healthcare, you know, shops, you know, in the high street, you know, full, unfortunately, perhaps, you know, we all support charities, but, you know, you're encouraging charities in because they can afford to pay a little bit more because they're getting 80% you know, relief from rates. Empty property rates, Rachel has raised rightly, I support the BBF's ask there should be a reversal. I mean, this is one of the interesting unintended consequences, unforeseen consequences of governments when they introduce changes. When Gordon Brown changed the empty rates regime, he announced it in 2007, came into force in 2008, so that the relief you got for empty property was slashed. And so basically you pay occupied rates for all properties after a short period. Well, he said that that would raise an extra £1 billion per annum for the Exchequer. That's why he did it, of course. If you analyse and you look at the amount of relief the government is now giving away, compared to what it did in 2007-8. In 2007-8, the amount of charitable rates relief that it paid was £783 million. This year it will be £2 billion. More than that billion. And I don't think this is because suddenly there has been a huge boom in demand for property by charities. It is simply businesses making use of the charity relief exemption, the 80% mandatory relief in business rates, to get charities in, take their properties off their hand, they pay them some money, a contribution to the charity, so they'll take them off their hands, and therefore they get out of their empty rates liability. You know, this has actually cost the Exchequer money by going down that road. It really should be thinking harder about what is going to be the business reaction to if they're imposing a tax on business. Are they going to take it lying down, or are they going to use professional advice to legally what is rateable and what is not. They were last reviewed in 1993. The world has changed out of all recognition since then, and what is included in a property for rating purposes needs to be fundamentally reviewed and overhauled. And thank you very much indeed.
For a moment I thought we were going to go back to the debate about powers, but I think I'm glad we don't have all the HMRC people we had in last time, so we might get some ideas about this idea about the entire burden of proof falling on the taxpayer. And also thanks for the tax planning tip that you managed to slot in quite towards the end. So we do have some time, about a quarter of an hour for questions. We can run on a little longer if people are enthusiastic. So I'll ask George first. Has anybody tweeted in?
No.
Okay. There we go. So they're still pondering. So so from the audience, yes, gentleman there.
Formats and oversight, so discussion academic. What taxing these through the presenters can bring quite a lot of ground in a bit of time. But one thing that doesn't seem to be considered, officially controversially, is the environmental consequences of various taxes. I'm referring in particular to a book I did at home called Nature's Capital. And this is the idea of preventing further environmental degradation. And a good example of that, of course, is in Brazil. In the last 20 years, 2/3 of their forest has actually disappeared, and that's had a dramatic effect. And to some extent, of course, I suppose that's a lack of supervision of what people are doing, exploiting the natural resources. I fear the same thing might actually happen in this country.
Stuart and Peter may be able to sort of respond and say, do you think the land value tax might be more environmentally sound than business rates, or is there another way that we could go for environment? Stuart first, please.
Well, I don't have a huge amount to say about this. I mean, there are various different environmental objectives that this might touch on. I mean, to some extent, a simple argument would just be, well, if we're worried about overdeveloping green spaces, then actually a tax that discourages property development will be a good idea. And business rates does that in a way that land value tax doesn't. But I think my response to that, and I think that's just one example of the environmental aspect. One example of my response to that and my response to the other environmental objectives would just be pick the right instrument for the right objectives. I would like the tax system to be doing, in this respect, what it does best. And then there may well be very different things you want to do through the planning system or through various other environmental instruments, including environmental taxes, to achieve your environmental objectives. I worry a bit about trying to design your property tax to be environmentally friendly, because I think you end up with a very complicated tax that isn't very good either as a property tax or as an environmental tax. I'd rather have kind of carefully targeted instruments aimed at each of the objectives that you want to get at.
Just a brief response, really, just to say that with the land tax, the danger is that you forget about the green spaces, the natural spaces that you want within a planned development, if you like. So to plan that, you have to red line. You have to sort of draw zones of where you want your factories and your shops and your houses and where you want the green space. And as soon as you do that, you're affecting land value. You're affecting what people can do with their land. So we have a different system in the UK now with regard to green belts, and, national parks, and land that can be developed. But if you go down a harder route and you're starting to zone, then someone has to make decisions about what's going to be not developed and what is going to be developed and what density it can be developed and what value could potentially be attached to that. And those are decisions that are political and affect people's land ownership rights, their tenure rights quite significantly.
Stuart Adam makes what I find a rather good, sorry, Andrew Packman from PwC. Stuart Adam makes what I find an argument I find difficult to refute, that in the long run, rates are borne by the property owner. And it seems to me that that's at the heart of this. And if he's right, then the view from Jerry Sherder and Rachel Kelly is essentially a request for a tax cut by property owners. So could I ask either of those people whether they agree with the basic contention that business rates in the long run are borne by the landlord?
Rachel, do you want to
as a representative landlord body.
And we did some, or commissioned some research a few years ago which agreed with that, you know, in the in the short run, business rates will be kind of shared between landlord and occupier, and after about 3 or 4 years, generally around 75% of the burden is capitalised into rents in some way. I feel like it might be a bit, I mean, yes, so the kind of immediate impact might be that it has an impact on rents. But I mean, I think we're in a position now where business rates are so out of kilter with rents that correlation might not necessarily be so true. And certainly the research that we commissioned, the correlation seemed to fall away after about 2008, when the recession hit, when the kind of structural shift in retail hit. Business rates kept going up, but actually rents have not kind of carried on the same trajectory. So I don't think the relationship is necessarily the same. I mean, our interest is to have a fair and proportionate tax system on business. And I think that's certainly best for landlords and best for the economy as a whole. So yeah, I mean, I think we just want the burden to be fair and proportionate. You know, as I said, we want a recurrent tax on property. We think that's a good tax to have in the basket of taxes. It just needs to be at the right level, but it's not kind of hindering our local economies.
I mean, I understand the economic theory entirely. I'm far from convinced that it's borne out in practice. I think two scenarios. If we were totally abolishing business rates, then I can see that certainly there would be an knee-jerk reaction from landlord that says, "Hey, that sounds like good news. We can charge more by way of rents." But you know, we're talking about a modest, relatively speaking, reduction. In fact, going back to where business rates were is what I'm sort of saying. So, arguably, you could say the fact that we've gone up from a 34.8% rates to a 15.4% rate has actually cost landlords over the last, the best part of sort of 30 years. So this is, landlords have borne the pain, and this is a matter maybe if the economic theory is true, that we will sort of, bring that sort of back into kilter. But this is another reason why I think that the annual revaluation cycle is so beneficial, because there is no point in a tenant agreeing a high rent because rates have come down, because if he does so, he knows jolly well his rates are going to be out the following year, because the valuation officer will have regard to the rent that he's paid and agree and put a high rateable value on him, and therefore there's going to be a high rates liability. So there will be an equilibrium position found between landlord and tenant.
John.
Thank you. John Whiting. I've got various hats. The one I'll put on, if I may, is an old one, which is, I spent a few years thinking about tax simplification and working on that. And I find myself looking at these arguments with that in mind. And one of the problems I can see with the attraction otherwise of land value tax is more subjectivity, more scope for argument, less easy to administer. Whereas rates, I mean, completely take Jerry's points, there's plenty of scope for arguments in that, but it is at least a little more objective, and indeed you can look at some of the other taxes that affect property, such as SDLT, which personally I hate with a passion, but it is at least relatively simple to administer. Why do I think a simple system or a simpler system is an important consideration? Well, it helps promote the certainty that I think everybody wants to see in the business growth. And I just wonder if there's any more reflection to be had as to whether the arguments we've heard today really would get us to a simpler tax, and if we're putting enough weight on that, because what we don't want to end up with is a tax that, with the greatest respect to various of the professions here represented, just create jobs for Gerald Eve or others in endless arguments about the values that are involved. And I will now put my HMRC come VOA hat on and say, we don't want a tax that creates a heck of a lot of admin as well.
I've got a quick answer, a quick response. I think I agree with nearly everything that you just said. I think one simple solution is, as Jerry and others have said, is a more regular revaluation, an annual revaluation of the business rates would be a good thing. It might even jolt the revaluation of the council tax, who knows. But one reason why I think that is because you kind of solve part of the land value issue by doing so, because if you regularly revalue, a lot of the change in value year on year isn't down to the improvements on the land. It's down to the land. You're actually capturing more of the land value shifts when you regularly revalue than you are the improvements, because generally speaking, we're not all busy adding bits to our properties and taking bits away. So values are not changing for that reason. They're changing because the location value has shifted. So we kind of do part of the land value tax job by doing the business rate properly.
I'm not hugely popular amongst my brethren in the rating fraternity, because actually what I argue for will do many of them out of their business, because we primarily make our money from success on appeals. And what I am arguing for is to take appeals out of the system, because there will be no need to do so, because there will be transparency, nor will there be any benefit in doing so because of the annual revaluation cycle. I'm looking for a sustainable form of taxation based upon properties which can be valued and can be assessed with a relative degree of simplicity. I am, of course, in great favour of land value taxation, because there would be a 100% appeal rate, and that ensures continuity of employment for rating surveyors.
Gary, isn't it?
Yes. Sorry, so am I? No, I'll share. Thank you. I was very interested that two of you had mentioned about plant machinery. So is an argument for tweaking the system to say that an Amazon warehouse is in fact dark retail because its end user is a person who gets something through post or possibly by drone? So sorry, to repeat the question, can you argue that you should value an Amazon warehouse as dark retail because the end consumer is essentially a retail customer, and the logic, because of the way it's used, and taking the plant and machinery point, apart from putting our grocery bills up, would an Ocado warehouse, which again has an end user who is a purchaser of retail, could you then argue for a different approach to applying our existing taxes to the value of those two properties? I'm just intrigued about the tweaking the existing system.
That's what we used to do.
Well, I'm not sure I have an enormous amount to say on that one. I'm slightly wary of tweaking the definitions to get the outcome that you want. I'm kind of more in favour of actually thinking about, should plant and machinery be in there to start with? I think there are several factors there, but we possibly don't want to go into that now, and if so, what's the right definition and way of measuring it? On the specifics, I suspect probably all of the other panellists know more about it than I do.
Yeah, I think this runs the risk of sort of, the law of unintended consequences, and one goes down that sort of route. Business rates is all about sort of equality and fairness, and everybody being assessed towards the same measure of annual rental value. And if you try to sort of come up with some form of definition which says, but if you are a warehouse which distributes direct to the consumer, you get valued on some other sort of basis. Well, Amazon have got a lot of clever advisors. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them. which will come up with a means to say, well, actually, they don't deliver direct to the warehouse. There'll be some intermediary third party which will stop that happening. I think it's right, clearly, that everyone should bear their fair proportion of total taxation, but I don't think the business rate system is the way to address whether Amazon are paying the right level of total taxes in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo those things. I mean, I think to keep the business rate system simple, I think if we can make sure that the valuations are as closely aligned with rental values, I think that's the best way to do that. And I think it's the easiest way for then ratepayers and taxpayers to see, how their rates are being calculated. And yeah, on making sure that new economies and tech giants pay their fair share, yeah, personally, I don't think the business rate system is the way to do that. Yeah, I think that, like I said before.
So destination-based property tax is about as far away as destination-based corporation tax. So do we have, there's at least one more. We'll go to the back first and I'll come back. You can have the honour of the last question, please.
Thank you very much. Rory Meakin, Taxpayers Alliance. I'd like to ask Stuart a question because although I agree with everything he said, I wonder if there's something missing from the analysis of the incidence of business rates, in that a sectoral, property sectoral analysis something missing there, because because basically commercial property is taxed a lot more heavily than residential property. So although the incidence will fall on the landlord has the choice of whether to try in the planning system to convert the property to different use. So wouldn't it be the case that commercial property is there's under suboptimal supply and too much residential supply relative to the commercial supply, not in absolute terms?
The short answer is essentially yes. I mean, the fact that commercial property is taxed effectively more heavily than residential property provides an incentive to try and convert commercial property to residential property, and we see a lot of that. And the planning system is kind of part of the way of dealing with that, and we've seen the government altering the planning system to try and change that balance to make it easier or harder as time goes on. But yeah, as I said, so the short answer is yes, it creates that incentive. Having said which, and that kind of would also be true if you're taxing essentially just land use for one purpose rather than another. Having said which, I think there is a good case for taxing the buildings on residential land, whereas I don't think there's a case for taxing the building on commercial land, which I think does create a kind of an incentive that I want to be there, just in the sense that whatever the commercial property is used to produce gets taxed when it's sold. And that's why you don't want to tax inputs into production, because we already tax the outputs. We levy, say VAT on the widgets that are produced in a factory, or equivalent. Whereas houses are themselves the final consumption good and ought to be taxed, so there should be a differential there in how the buildings are taxed. But ideally you would have no differential in how the land is taxed. But given where we are, I'm not sure I necessarily want to even that out. And as I given that there are so many other considerations for the government to intervene there, and so much that the planning system already does, I'm not sure that's something I would necessarily want to try and level out head on.
The concept of a widget making factory lives on. Peter, final question.
Peter Rainey. The question I have is, does the panel think that business rates is the only lever that we can use to stop the demise of our high streets and provincial towns?
Who would like to take that one first? I will start.
I'm happy to start. No, I'm sure it's not the only lever. And as has been said, rates are not the cause of the demise of the high street, but they are clearly a contributory factor, and they need to be reduced and reformed in the way that I've said. whether we can save every high street in the country, I somehow doubt. That's the way of the world, and the world is changing. But we need to make sure that we have a taxation system that is fair, and I don't think it is at the moment.
Peter?
No, I've got nothing to add.
I'm delighted to ask the question because the answer is absolutely no. There are lots of things that the government can and should be using to address issues with their high street and indeed with land use and the future shape of the economy more generally. Business rates are a contributory factor. I don't want to overstate the case, but it's not. I don't think it's the major factor, and I don't think it's really the main tool that the government should be using. There are other things the government can and indeed is doing in this, but there's a lot more that it could be looking at, and there I think some really big picture thinking going forward is needed.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that a lot of people would say that the future of our high street is going to change, is going to have less retail in the future. We want to see probably a greater mix of asset classes and uses. I think that's going to take a bit of vision from local authorities. They're going to need to have kind of local plans. They're going to need to bring together all of the players, landlords, occupiers themselves. There's going to need to be greater flexibility and adaptability in the planning system, although obviously balancing that with the need for local authorities to kind of retain some control to make sure that they can fulfil their vision. And the likes of something like permitted development rights might not necessarily be the best way to, although it's very flexible and adaptable, to change office space into residential. That kind of takes away a bit of control to the local authorities to kind of curate the space that they want. I agree. I think business rates are part of the picture and are causing some challenges at the moment, but just reducing business rates is not going to be the solution for our high streets.
Right. I'll say, bring the debate to a close. I'd like you to thank once more all of the panellists for their contribution. I will declare business rates are probably the winner of the evening, however flawed and however much some would like them to be reduced or reformed. And I would like to invite you to join us in the room for a drink, and in that way you can avoid having to dash home and watch the leadership debate, which has started. No reports of any gas from Boris yet. So thank you very much for coming and enjoying this.